1, 2, 3, 4.
Hi, and welcome to the Vininspo podcast with me, Ed Merrison. This is where wine is a travel experience. Join us as we pick up bits and pieces, make new friends, and create memories that make our future interactions with wine, people, and places all the more meaningful and fun. My guest on this week's podcast is Tim Shan, Chief Winemaker at Voyager Estate in Margaret River. I got to know Tim during his time at the helm of Punt Road in Victoria's Yarra Valley. More recently, he was instrumental in lining up my interview with AC Grayling for episode 10 of the podcast. For this episode, we talked about fear and loathing in the Haut-Médoc, the value of a post-work wind-down beer with your peers, how to over-deliver from a workmanlike site, the power of the imagination, and what happens if the wine world fails to harness it, pondering legacy at the start of a new challenge, halcyon days at the Mene du Jacques, and the solace of philosophy after a hectic harvest. I started by asking Tim how the young Master Shan shaped up for future success.
I was actually born in London, but we came to Perth because my mum was from WA and my parents were both teachers, like PJ Charteris. But my parents definitely didn't push me into the great outdoors and being raised by wolves like PJ. It was a far more sedate upbringing than PJ and his two teacher parents, which is very disappointing now that I look back and hear PJ's take. So they were both primary school teachers and I was an only child. That's probably important. There's probably a bit of therapy there. And my dad was English. So, you know, it was a very Australian mid-1980s upbringing that I had, no doubt.
Suburban Perth?
In the western suburbs of Perth, so in Claremont. And that was related to my dad working at one of the more prestigious private schools in Perth. So therefore I went to that school. We got a healthy discount for me to go to that particular private school. So my white-breadedness got even more white-breadedness at that point. But, you know, I guess the one thing I would have taken from that, which has possibly served me well, there was more than one thing, but something that's possibly served me well in the world of wine is being comfortable in an environment, you know, of wealth, of quite a lot of potentially power or ego or, you know, quite intense social scenarios, I suppose, and talking to wine and holding your own and in a business sense. So it was good for that. You know, I have friends who went to government high schools, and I think there's always a level. And in a way for them it's been a great thing because it's the grit of sand in the pearl shell. But they, I think, always feel like they're punching up, and it's more energy for them to walk into those rooms and speak how they want to speak and get their message across, whereas it's never really bothered me greatly. You know how the other half live, and you know that their shit smells just as bad.
And you weren't particularly diligent or well-behaved, were you, as a young kid?
Well, no, I was pretty well-behaved. I probably wasn't diligent. Yeah, it just lacked application, I think. And certainly as my teenage years and then into university, I really was that classic, you know, had no independence to be able to just study and do things off my own back. I'd gone to quite a structured, rigorous high school, so that probably got me through. And then without that structure around me, I just, you know, the TAV was my place of learning at the age of 17, 18, 19. And that was, as you and I have discussed before, an arts degree at UWA. And then got ceremoniously booted from that arts degree, quite rightly, by the dean or whoever does those. I don't know, who does that? Who does the booting? I can't even remember. Anyway, that guy, he booted me. And then I was very lost at that point. I didn't know what to do. And what a squandered education and opportunity. You know, the Ange Postecoglou overnight, you know, his dad gets on a boat from Greece and gets the family to Australia, and his son goes on to head back to Europe and win the Europa League. And I squandered my immigration opportunity by flunking out of an arts degree.
I don't know if you have to compare yourself to Ange, but you did end up going overseas, didn't you?
Yeah, and that was when things clicked a little. I'd always had a fascination with Southern and Eastern Africa. You know, I read The Power of One and Peter Godwin's books, Makiwa and books like that, and I think they felt very exotic. But politically, I found it really interesting as well, Zimbabwe and South Africa, and so I was very keen to go to Eastern South Africa. And also was lucky enough to go to Egypt. That was about 1999, I think, and this was sort of off the back of, you know, just sort of not having anything per se to do. And I had relatives in Zimbabwe and just getting about, and then in the UK, and particularly, you know, in London, which is such a big city for someone from Perth, and feeling very anonymous and very uncared for, in some cheap hostel in London, and you just realise there's absolutely no one coming, there's no cavalry coming to save you, and you better just work this out pretty quick, what you're going to do and why the world should bother. That was a good lesson.
So far, apart from the time spent in the pub, nothing is really pointing in that wine direction. How did that come about?
It was a time in Western Australia where Margaret River was really establishing itself, and the people of Perth were hyper aware of something very exciting, I think, going on in Margaret River. And then in Great Southern, which is where my mum was from, she was from around not that far from Franklin, there was massive investment. Obviously Franklin had always existed, Franklin Estate, but Ferngrove and Goundry and places like that were really getting to be substantial businesses. So everyone was very aware that this was going on. And I guess because of my mum's background in farming, I did have a little either DNA or a little interest in getting that, but also had seen the harder side of that. Her brothers had gone on to be sheep farmers, and it was not an easy life, and there was nothing romantic about it. And that's a pretty scrubby, Coaching up and Mount Barker, it's a pretty scrubby place to make a living out of sheep. I'd spent my school holidays with those uncles, and it didn't greatly appeal. So having a bent towards agriculture, but then seeing that it didn't have to be that way with the wine industry, which was so cock-a-hoop at the time, there was such optimism. I was like, I need something very, very specific and very structured to get into, and I need to know what degree I need to get and what work experience I then need to get, and then I'll be away. And that's how it transpired, thank goodness.
Did you get some work experience before you started the study?
No, I reckon I was at Goundry in my first summer holidays in the vineyard after my first year of uni, and that was thankless work. That was, cutting out powdery mildew from hectares of vineyard Chardonnay down there, replacing posts, just weeding, hand weeding. I remember a lot of hand weeding, and living in Mount Barker, as a, I don't know what I was then, 21-year-old. I would not recommend that to anybody.
Right, so it didn't click the first time you set foot in a vineyard then?
No, yes. And again, I'm a hopelessly slow learner. So I think, those people who you hear, it all just came together and then they were ready. No, that's not me. I cotton on about 2 years later what was going on and what it meant. And I'm just very slow on that front.
All right. So in that case, where did it start to click? Or was it just that you got a better job and that's the path?
Yeah, it did really start to click when I had to go and do my first harvest experience in a winery. I hadn't really explored going to Adelaide Uni at all, so I'd gone to Curtin University in Perth, and that probably reflects the fact that I didn't quite know what I was doing. And unfortunately, the Curtin University course in wine science doesn't exist anymore. But as with Adelaide, they gave you the time off to go and do your vintage experience before you graduate. You had to do it to graduate. And I literally picked up Halliday and looked for 5 Red Star, I don't even know the Red Stars back then, but 5-star wineries not in WA, because I thought I want to get out and have a look at something else. And then contacted a few of those, and I think the only one that got back was actually Anna Flauda, I think, in the first instance, but Kerry Thompson at Leasingham Winery in Clare, because they were taking on a big enough team to take people with no experience like me. And so then I had to up sticks and obviously go to the Clare Valley and get away from Western Australia and my hometown of Perth, which was a very good thing. And that was the 2004 vintage in Clare.
I was actually speaking to Anna Flowerday just earlier today about her first experiences at Leasingham.
She wasn't even there by the time I got there. I think she'd employ me and then left. And Kerry was obviously in charge at that point. Yeah.
And how was it working with KT?
The whole experience was excellent because it was a time of great optimism. The Hardy, I think it was BRL Hardy there, then owned Leasingham. So they had an excellent structure around the wineries that they owned. They would have had Tintara, Stonehaven, Berry, Horton, obviously Bay of Fires, Yarra. This was a wine company of significance. It's really underestimated in Australian wine. The people that came out of that system, Larry Cherubino, Ross Pammett in WA, Pete Dillon, Kerry and Anna, Simon Ossiker, Mark O'Callaghan, Steve Flamsteed, Sue Bell. I'm gonna miss some people, but without going on a tangent, it's a concern now that we don't have potentially those wine businesses that are a bit of a stomping ground or a training ground for those people to cut their teeth. So I walked into an excellent structure for someone who had never worked in a winery before, where BRL Hardy was willing to say for 3 weeks you will just be trained. And some of the training will be incredibly boring, like you will do 2 days of confined space training.
Confined space training? That sounds like a Guantanamo Bay thing.
We're going to put you in a very small box and you have to get out of it. No, literally, a tank or a press in a winery is considered a confined space. A confined space is defined by, the ability to be overcome by some sort of fumes in that space, for it not to be well ventilated, for there only to be one entry and exit, At that time, we get into those spaces less and less. Well, certainly I do as a chief winemaker. I never get into those spaces anymore. You had to have an ability to safely enter, to test the atmosphere and safely enter and do whatever you had to do, whether it was shoveling leaves out of the door or planks into the tank or out of the tank, or mark, obviously, shoveled out as well. So you had to learn how to measure the atmosphere, CO2, carbon monoxide and oxygen in the vessel, and then how to physically get in. Also wear a harness, and then somebody had to be trained, and you had to be trained in how to physically get you out if you happened to collapse. Yeah, we had breathing apparatus on the go, which I don't know if we do these days. So yeah, that was 2 days. Because, the people sitting at offices in Adelaide running, or in McLaren, Tintara, running BRL Hardy, were just like, my God, we've got hundreds of vintage casuals around Australia all hopping into these vessels, and we need to, probably cover their asses if one of us got so inundated by CO2. And a 2-day course sounds like covering enough ass to stay out of jail if that does happen. That's just an example of the thoroughness. But there was also, a guy came in from the local TAFE and talked us through centrifugal pumps versus monos, which for me was, never heard of that before. So that was good. And you almost did your Cert 1 in cellar handing. And they were really good as well. They had tastings but there was a lot of us. I don't know what Leasingen was doing, maybe 4,000 tonnes. But again, this was the boom. This was the peak of the boom of the red wine going to the UK, the US. They would have taken on 30 vintage casuals, I reckon, that were sitting in that classroom. And so we had 5 or 6 European, stagiaires doing their Australian vintage. We had local, sheep farmers who just wanted to make some money over vintage. Adelaide uni students, there would have been 3 or 4 of them, and then me and a mate from Curtin. So it was an excellent band of people to do your first harvest with. It was quite commercial, and you did get stuck on, 1 or 2 jobs and didn't do the, if you work at a small winery, like Voyager or Giant Steps, you tend to do a bit of everything because you have to. You do tend to get stuck on certain jobs, which I kind of did, but just as a way to start off and get a grounding, it was a very good one.
And do you find with that bigger team, do you find yourself naturally trying to stand out, or are you just trying to keep your head down and get things done? At that stage, was there an idea that you had to impress someone? Yeah,
there was, to be honest. Because you were looking at those 4 or 5 Adelaide students, you were looking at your Curtin mate, and it was a time when they were churning out grads, like the Adelaide Uni and Curtin and Wagga. You could turn a rock and an assistant winemaker would hop out. People who were trained and qualified in Bachelor of Science in Wine were working as cellar hands and for a long time, and cracking that assistant winemaker gig was back then really difficult. Because so many people had seen, like me, they'd seen what a great industry it was and wanted a part of it. That was the boom for people wanting to get into this industry. And we were being encouraged to as well. We were being encouraged to plant vineyard, we were being encouraged to build wineries, we were being encouraged to study winemaking and viticulture. I do have one recollection. I was on night shift, which was great. Most people you speak to who work night shift love it because all of the noise and all of the fuss is out, and your night shift team actually becomes very tight, and you get a lot of work done on nights because you're not getting interrupted and you've got that focus. And also, to be honest, you can cut corners. You can do things on nights that you're not allowed to do on days. So you love night shift. And I heard that Paul Lapsley, who was the group winemaker for Hardy's, was coming the next day. I think we were sampling on nights, Rieslings and Shirazes and Cabernets for him to taste. His job was to go around all these wineries around the country and, work with Kerry, hopefully, in the best scenario. He was her boss, but your dream is he brings his expertise. And Kerry brings her knowledge and knowledge of Claire, and they make better wines as a result. The criticism is that you get a homogeneity to the wine styles across your Hardies because Paul would have his preference, and people would start to kind of lean into what he would see. I don't think that's the case with what was happening. Anyway, I'd heard that Paul was coming. We were lining up a lot of wines for this tasting, and I just said to Kerry, look, I'm finishing at 7 a.m. Saw her first thing in the morning. Said, look, can I stay on? Can I just stay through day shift as well? I've sort of been there 13, 14 hours at this point. And she was like, yeah, probably. She wouldn't say this today, or they certainly wouldn't in a big company. But she said, yeah, do it. Come and taste with us. And so I'm tasting away, and Paul's sort of like, who's that peanut? And Kerry's like, he's on night shift, but he's asked to stay on during the day to do this tasting with us. And I think Paul was like, okay, he might be quite serious about this. And then I managed to say something intelligent at some point. I think I used the word texture in a good context, and then got an invite back the next year to be an assistant at Leasingen. So that was the 05 vintage, yeah.
Was that when you were finishing up at Curtin?
Yeah, so that I went back to finish off my studies. The Curtin University had moved their campus to Margaret River for that last year I studied. which was excellent as well because that detached me from Perth. I never went back to Perth, basically, after I left to go vintage at Elysium. So I've finished my studies in Margs, worked at West Felix, and again, not in any romantic way, worked on the bottling line, worked in the vineyard with Bruce Pearce a bit, but honestly just wine lifting and doing stuff like that. In the cellar door at West Felix, which actually was really, really informative and really, really interesting for me because that's an excellent cellar door that not only has a very welcoming atmosphere and a high standard of wine service, but they genuinely sell wine. Like it's a place where you can really get people excited and they can spend a lot of money on wine. So it was good to see how that worked. And then, by the end of that year, it was time to go back to Clare and take that little step up with that assistant gig for the vintage in 2005.
At that stage, were you sort of on probation, potentially past vintage, if that turned out well at Hardy's?
That's a good question. There was certainly an extended, you can hang around for a bit, but it was always understood I'd start doing the Northern Hemisphere vintage thing as well at that point. But I did get the feeling that Hardy's was making a bit of room, hopefully, for me to work within the system. If you got Kerry on side and Paul on side, they needed people. And they needed people in random places, potentially doing random things. So that was an option that was available.
Speaking of Northern Harvests, do you recognise any of these words? It was awful. I wasn't allowed to do anything. They all hated me. It was 3 months of torture. I used to call my wife in tears.
You've actually traumatised... This is an interview you and I did a long time ago, and you've actually traumatised my mother because she was unaware of this, that Bordeaux was such a traumatic experience for me. And we've all tried to forget it in our family.
Plum job of what? Chateau Margaux or something, wasn't it?
Yeah, that's right. And it had been highly recommended to me. That was the whole story. I chased the now, unfortunately, departed Paul Pontellier around the communications globe. I think there was faxes involved and emails and to beg for a job because what I was trying to do was work for his winery in Chile from memory. And for whatever reason, that didn't work out. And... yeah, that's what I was trying to do. I was trying to work in Chile. It didn't work out. I was like, well, would you actually have me at Chateau Margaux? But didn't respond and worked through his assistant and just kept berating him to get this gig. And I'd had a mate, a Canadian bloke who'd worked at Margaux the year before, loved it. But secret was he spoke French really well. And he was just probably a nicer guy. He was a bit more diplomatic than me. And he'd gone really well. Brad Graytrix, actually. So he ended up at Nightimber in the UK. Yeah. Amazing guy. Excellent guy. And his Mrs. Sherry Spriggs as well, I should mention. So I'd worked with them at Domaine Drouin in Oregon. Well, actually, Brad had worked at Serene and Sherry had worked at Drouin. So I'd sort of got on this pathway to Pontellier. Oh, that's right. That was through Veronique Drouin, who'd given me Pontellier's details. So then I just started stalking him. And I had very high expectations. Brad had talked it up. I thought it was going to be incredible. And when I got there, just a couple of things went awry. I think my French and my sort of Australian abruptness, I didn't quite sort of all hail all the people in vineyards and winery of Chateau Margaux. I sort of, as you tend to do, took a fairly... cynical is probably too strong a word, but, I didn't necessarily buy into all the hype.
Skeptical.
I was a skeptic. I was a Margaux skeptic. And they didn't like that. And then I think I was misunderstood a couple of times with my French and... there was actually a Chilean guy working. He was running their vineyard team, and then he came into the winery. He was like working with Che Guevara. This guy was trying to bring Bordeaux down from the inside. He was awesome. Like his blood flowed very hot, and so he and I became a bit of a duo. And then he got a reputation within Margaux as a bit of a rebel rouser. And then I sort of copped it because I was a mate of his. And so I became a bit ostracised in Chateau Margaux. And then I was disappointed because we weren't really doing anything. There was a couple of stagiaires from Bordeaux Uni. They didn't like me at all. We were living together and I was just like, let's all share our wine and share our food. And they were like, no, we just eat our own food and drink our own wine and go away.
That's very much not the spirit of the Vininspo podcast.
Exactly. And then this maniac Italian, I think he was from Alto Adige, who'd somehow got a job at Margaux and could barely speak English. He was a savage and we were all sort of a bit scared of him and he was living in the house. And so this really horrible domestic situation. I was there for a long time. And, if anyone's been to Bordeaux, Margaux is like a bakery and a tabac. There's nothing going on at all. And it was a bit tricky to get into Bordeaux on a Sunday. And, so I was a bit stuck in this house on the river. And then the Bordelais they're their own people, I think it's fair to say. Their French is very hard to understand, like the Mediocrians. Like it is quite scrawly and, they cut words short and they have a lot of slang, obviously. So I found that hard. Someone like Pontellier spoke, I could understand him quite clearly. Probably because he was speaking English, but so we're all sitting around, four of us sitting around with our hands in our pockets watching a guy work a pump and do a pump over. And, you've just come from a 3,000 tonne winery in Clare where you had 3 pumps doing pump overs. And so that was frustrating. And they tried to get us involved in some technical stuff. There was some really excellent vineyard sampling, and you'd be out there, bringing fruit to taste as we made picking decisions. There was a few they were doing trials, and I sort of was lucky enough to get involved in that with the technical officer for Margot, and she was lovely. But, she took me to the rugby. The Rugby World Cup was on in Bordeaux. Australia played Canada. And I swear she kind of had to distance herself from me because we came back the next week and I was telling everyone I went to the rugby with this poor woman. And then she started to get tainted with the brush of hanging out with me at the weekend. So she sort of had yeah, so anyway, I think I've just traumatised my mother all over again if she listens to this podcast.
Well, I have to say, I'm trying to break away from any stereotypes about Bordeaux, but this hasn't helped. This has put this back a few weeks.
Yeah, and I never went in the chateau. Like, the winery is the winery at Margot, and this was pre the recon or the refurb that they did, and I never went in the chateau. Corinne Mentalopoulos, I don't know if she's still around. Her son, it definitely is still around. She lived in the chateau, so no, I wasn't allowed in there. I tasted a lot of Margot, and of course the 05s were still in barrel, so that was pretty cool. They've got their own cooper. I actually really like the cooper. I would hide in the cooperage and just chat to the cooper, who I don't think understood anything I said, and it's certainly vice versa. But I did love to hang out with the cooper. He was cool.
The only, I suppose, positive of that is I don't think you're going to be spinning your Margot experience into this is how we make wine at Voyager estate later in life story.
Oh, look, the meticulousness of the viticulture of those, first and second growths and a few others in the Medoc is something you need to take with you. That I certainly took with me. I did find the winery a bit slapdash at the time. I dare say they've lifted their standards a lot, but yeah, I didn't think that they matched. I think the meticulousness of the vineyard and the winery were not one and the same, that's for sure.
And at the same time, you had a vastly divergent experience in Burgundy, which again probably perpetuates the halo effect that Burgundy
completely
experiences in the wine world. But that was a great thing for all round, wasn't it? Family, life, and the spirit of Burgundy that you found yourself in there.
Yeah, and again, stemmed from Bordeaux and stemmed from Veronique Drouin, who had worked through it for in Oregon, put me in touch with the Sass family, and extends from that Bordeaux time. The last week of my trip to France to work at Margot, I went to Burgundy and managed to get a visit just off the back of Veronique. And on the tour with Jeremy and Alex Sess, just happened to drop the fact that I had this bloody EU passport from being born in London. And, I'd sort of said I would like to work vintage, and they'd sort of gone, well, join the list, sunshine. You're about 73rd on the list of people who want to be a stagiaire at Dujac. But the minute they heard EU passport, they must have just I think they'd had trouble with a couple of people who weren't legal, and that had come back to bite them in the arse, and they'd been inspected and stuff. So on the spot said, come back next year for vintage, which would have been vintage... Get this right. So 07 was Bordeaux, vintage 08 in Burgundy, which remains the greatest month of my life. I think I was there 2 months, so the greatest 2 months of my life. The thing, just to go off tangent, the thing I love about Burgundy or probably Alsace or anywhere, which is very specific on variety and site, is your vintage, your harvest is 2 weeks. You spend 2 weeks harvesting grapes probably. You spend obviously 2 weeks fermenting those grapes, 1 week, 2 weeks thinking about pressing the grapes, get them dry, a week putting them to barrel. That's the vintage. I've worked some godforsaken vintages in Australia, like McWilliams in Griffith, where we'd start with Hunter Valley Shiraz in middle of January and finish with some bloody god-awful Adelaide Hills Merlot in end of May. And then you wake up and go, I just spent 6 months of my life doing vintage. This is not how it's supposed to be, but, commercial wineries try to squeeze every drop out of their presses / tanks / humans. The Burgundians kind of, it's how it's always been done, right? Pinot Noir, and it's ripe, and let's go, and the tanks suit the blocks. You only probably fill every tank once with grapes. So that daily rhythm was fantastic, and then the end was always in sight. You always knew where you were headed and what was next. Obviously the long lunches, and Jeremy would disappear to the cellar, and I should have mentioned with the Drouins in Oregon, obviously they had their feet in both continents, US and France. So they were forced to speak English with me, but also obviously cosmopolitan in their wine tastes. And then you rock up to Jeremy at Dujac, who's even more so, his wife working in the US and from the US, but also an appreciation of all the wines. How many Burgundian cellars would you be exploring? Barolo at that time, nearly 20 years ago. Obviously American wines, but he had a fascination with Australian wines because of his link with Gary Farr. So an incredibly eclectic cellar and palate. And so he would just pop down to the cellar for lunch and you'd taste wine blind, and it could be anything from a Montelena to a 78 Clos de Roche or even a DRC if you were lucky. The wine would be delivered with no pomp and circumstance. So, that's true blind tasting, where it could literally be anything. It could be something that caught Jeremy's eye from Hungary, or it could be something that's worth now, certainly thousands of dollars, that he would serve without even a raised eyebrow.
Yeah, fantastic.
But I did get him. They gave me a small stipend, and he told me the whole time, don't play the man, play the ball. He might have used that analogy, that Aussie rules analogy, but maybe my brain's playing tricks on me. But we'd all been copying it. He'd say, how old's this? And you'd be like, 90s, and it's like 1972 or something. I'd been getting, my ass whipped in the options world for the whole couple of months, and then you got your stipend at the end of whatever you got paid, which was bugger all, but that's all right, because we'd eaten and lived and everything there. And so I snuck off to Nuit Saint-Georges and bought a bottle of Chardonnay from Montlouison, which is in Moray, I think. And he actually has a block of Montlouison to make his only white, I think. It wasn't the Dujac Montlouison, but I turned up to lunch the next day with this Montlouison, and he's completely played the man, not the ball. Thought I've smuggled this in from Australia and started, crapping on about Australian Chardonnay. It's like, well, it's just up the road, my friend. That was a good moment.
Nice one. I haven't actually met Jeremy. I've just had one dealing with him, but I gather not only very worldly with that appreciation of wine and very thoughtful, but also not really into the things that don't matter.
Yeah, and this is a guy who has to endlessly talk about his very small amount of wines. He didn't buy into the bullshit at all. We're talking a lot at the moment at Voyager about where we put our energy and our resources to give value to the customer. And I wonder if Jeremy's very good at that. I think he probably is.
Yeah, well, we'll again get onto that, and maybe about some of that ethos and how you're presenting those wines and encouraging your team to communicate them a bit later, because we'll get back to the timeline. Where were you next then after those Northern Hemisphere gigs and your time at Leasingham in Clare? What was next on the agenda?
So I'd worked Oregon, Bordeaux, Burgundy, Chile, Chianti. You do get to a point where it's like, well, this has been fun and I've learnt a lot, but actually you do need to work in a winery for a 12-month period to see the other stages of winemaking that are just as important. And also it's probably getting to an age where it was time to stop doing that as well. So my wife, as we travelled in that last year, got a job as a lawyer in Melbourne. She's very qualified and competent, my wife, and I'm very fortunate in that early stage in that she kind of kept the home fires burning. So we actually moved to Melbourne, and that was the point where that Hardy's system kind of grabbed me, because they had the Yarra winery, obviously the Yarra Valley, and it literally was, for us, because her work was very important and she'd got an amazing gig in Melbourne, it really was, how do we make this work to be together? I've got ambition in wine, and where is this geographically possible? So it was Melbourne, and then contacting Paul Apsley, who contacted Mark O'Callaghan to work at the Yarra winery, and not even on a permanent basis to start, but as a vintage assistant winemaker. And Mark had the very unenviable task, and probably getting into how the sausage is made in terms of wine making in Australia. He literally was charged with running a winery for the vintage period and basically mothballing it after that. So this was a winery that juiced a lot of sparkling. People might remember the Yarra sparkling. We would juice something like 3,000 or 4,000 tonnes of Chardonnay and Pinot Noir grapes, stabilise the juice and put it on a tanker to Adelaide, into the Ed Carr family of wines, and Ed would take it from there. And it makes a lot of sense, the juicing has to happen quickly. The fermentation and the maturation, under Ed's careful gaze is probably a good thing. And a lot of sparkling only really works with that sort of scale. So that was most of what we did. From a standing start, we'd put on a team of 15 casual cellar hands for vintage. Mark would be running all over the Yarra Valley, because we were probably the biggest buyer of fruit in the Yarra Valley, and had a few vineyards of our own, obviously, including the Bastard Hill vineyard. And then we'd make small amounts of table wine as well. But even that, we were either fermenting Chardonnay in barrel until it went dry, and then putting those barrels on a truck to Tintara Winery in McLaren Vale, or we were fermenting Pinot on skins until it went dry and Malo dry, and then actually we were going to barrel with that as well, and then barrels would go on the truck. It was a very odd situation. It would sound very odd to people at home, but by the end of May, we were literally cleaning everything and locking the doors, and then I would be, in the first year or so, going off to Bordeaux or Burgundy. Right. But we pushed really hard because it was getting a bit untenable. Like, it was really hard out to put this team of people together from scratch every year, to work under a lot of pressure. And a site that was really bursting at the seams. And people could see how wearing it was, but also how important the quality of those Yarra wines that had to be kept safe. And so we sort of asked if we could finish the table wines ourselves, and I could have a permanent job. And I also offered to prune and all that sort of stuff, whatever. I had a mate's dad at the time, so he just got to offer to paint the walls or clean the cobwebs or whatever, just to hang around. So I did. Yeah, but unfortunately that was 2010, and we only got 1 year before the bean counters got hold of us, and Constellation Brands had taken over Hardy's at the time, and they just couldn't do the maths on this little satellite winery, trucking most of its juice to Ed, making small amounts of table wine, which were fantastic. And we were making the Eileen Hardy, Pinot and Chardonnay. Stuff was coming from Tassie, stuff was coming from Tumbarumba, and obviously Yarra and Busted Hill in particular. And the bean counter just got hold of us on the wrong day, sent the CEO in to shut us down, and they took all that winemaking to Domaine Chandon, I think, at the time, who just obviously do it for a fee.
Yeah,
so
right.
That was another crisis at that point because I was unemployed and living in Melbourne. And that's when I ended up at Griffith, which was a whole other thing.
Yeah, and from that experience, we got a real variety. The big company winemaking, some fairly sort of factory style work going on in some stages, but also a big sort of brains trust through that big company scenario as well.
Yeah, and rigor, like you were working with people like Simon Oscar and Paul Carpenter and Kerry and Sue Bell. And, if you said something ridiculous or you didn't bring it, you knew where you stood and you really wanted to bring it. And we do lack that today, unfortunately, because we don't have that collegiate. Collegiate sort of goes both ways, doesn't it? You've got people around you who build you up and, you're talking and learning, but also, frankly, keeping you in line and setting the bar. And there were some really impressive people to be around. No,
yeah.
Quite lucky.
And the depth of experience as well.
Yes.
Even with your marathon harvests, I mean, you're seeing so many things and getting so much experience.
That's not to be sneezed at, yeah.
If you don't inherit that Burgundy domain that you can work a focused 5 or so weeks for harvest, then I guess you've got to learn some other skills, which you did. And took those not long after to Giant Steps and the beginning of a Yarra Valley adventure that lasted... about a decade? Yeah.
No, I was really fortunate. So, just under 12 months I was in Griffith between Yarraburn and Giant Steps, ostensibly. So I worked the 2010 vintage at Yarraburn, then the 2011 vintage in Griffith, which I really liked. And again, some great people like Andrew Higgins, Sam Brewer, Adrian Sparks. I'm reluctant to mention Adrian. He doesn't need any more smoke blown up his ass. But, good people who I still talk to a lot and actually really love the way they go about it. But did return to the Yarra Valley in 2011 to work for Flamo at Giant Steps. So that was, first vintage was 2012. And Dave McIntosh had been there before me and they'd really started to fire on the vineyards they were getting fruit from, including the vineyards they owned. Innocent Bystander Moscato was just a tour de force. Incredible volumes, incredible generator of income for the winery, but also genuinely making a difference in the world of wine in terms of good quality, muscat juice coming out of the riverland around that sort of area and then turning it into something that people loved. I mean, they loved it. So that was kind of cool to work for something so successful and so loved in a very evocative way. And then to be also obviously making these single vineyard Chardonnays and Pinot Noirs that were really, the world was waking up to. It was a good time to be in the Yarra Valley, that's for sure.
Yeah, and obviously Steve Flamsteed articulated his own role very well and fairly modestly, as you'd expect. But I know that he had quite an impact on the way you saw him operate in terms of, immense drive and work ethic and just getting things done.
Oh, my word, his capacity is second to none. But I guess there is a danger with that background I've described that you could be a little bit cardboard cut out, a bit white bread with the way you go about making wine. And even though Flamo had done his time at Hardy's, at Yarraburn, he had done enough and been enough before that wasn't going to put him in a corner. Yeah, so to see, more of an avant-garde, bespoke approach to wine, a craft, a genuine craft, but also to be at a point in my life where I could spend the time with him as well. The best times were having a beer 6 o'clock after a long day and what a great spot that Innocent Bystander Giant Steps cellar door. That completely rearranged the polarity of Healesville. Like that was, the bakery, the cheese room, and a great kitchen. And, Phil Sexton's beer list and the guest wine list, just a great place to cut your teeth. But yeah, it'd be 6, 7 o'clock at night with Steve where you could actually sit down and then Dave Bicknell would come in for a beer or Timo Mayer or whoever. That's when I certainly learnt the most. And you do think about, just as a complete non sequitur, you think about COVID and then working from home. And, and my wife works from home. I fully understand the benefits, but you think, those young people coming up and working from home, they don't get that. Let's have a beer and let's just chew the world over at 6 o'clock.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And then Punt Road, you had in the Yarra Valley, really your first chance to really put your spin on something, taking a little bit of everything you'd learned, a little bit of the Giant Steps ethos, I think, kind of fed into that upswing in quality and definition, I suppose, recognition of labels and that sort of stuff, a real organisational thing, which brought a little bit of the what I kind of regard as the Tim Shan puzzle-solving ethos to the game. How did you find your time at Punt Road?
Oh, you absolutely have to have it. You have to be put in a position where it's on you, and God, I just shudder now when I think of how I'd get maybe frustrated with Flamo, who'd be really busy or be off somewhere and you'd need an answer, or just not understanding the balls that he had in the air. Like, no idea. Just in my own little box of what I was worried about in my little winery at Giant Steps, and poor Flamo's running around the Yarra Valley and dealing with Phil Sexton and his expectations. And now, obviously, I'm in these sort of positions and you think, wow, there's so much on your shoulders. But Punt Road was a very gentle introduction to that because there wasn't a lot of expectation. Certainly I felt much more coming to Voyager. The wines were good, but not great. They filled a commercial space. But yeah, walked into a really unloved team, a team that felt really sapped of confidence. Owners who had lost confidence in the winery at the time because, they were fruit growers. The wine industry just was like, this is so frustrating, understandably, for them. So the only way was up. It was the perfect scenario. And you're right, taking the Giant Step skills, but also with no sense of an inflated sense of my own ego where I didn't want to deal with some of that hard stuff and some of the more commercial conversations that had to be had. That wasn't really a problem. In fact, to me, was quite exciting. How do you make wines as interesting as the Giant Steps wines? You probably haven't got the fruit pedigree. You're not got Applejack or Bastard Hill or Terraford coming in. You've got a very workmanlike vineyard in the lower Yarra Valley, a big vineyard with the usual Yarra Valley varieties, some very special little spots in there. But how do we reimagine what's going on here for something commercially relevant but exciting as well?
And how did you do that?
Oh.
I think winemaking is probably the wrong word because the connotations there are of some kind of trickery, but it's a thoughtfulness about the use of fruit as much as anything else, probably, and the operational nous to do everything when it needs to be done, how it needs to be done.
Yes.
Is that a little bit of how you turn something that's good, middling, workmanlike into something that's a little bit more exciting and actually going to jump out in a crowded marketplace, on a crowded shelf?
Yeah.
And give the drinker a little bit more.
Yeah, that's right. So it really is finding the few inputs that you've got, where is the value for the customer. So Airlie Bank Pinot Noir would be the best example. Yes, we cropped pretty healthily, but by the same token, if we took that into account and didn't throw enormous amounts of oak and time in oak at it and tried to over-extract tannin that might not be as ripe as you'd want, then you can address that. Yes, we might have to machine pick quite a lot, but how much hand picking can we do? And then from that hand picking, it's got to be 100% whole bunch ferments, probably in a Cab-Mac sort of style, and then work that back. And then learning some of that gentleness, because I think there's a danger with commerciality in winemaking that you do the easy stuff. So filtration, maybe fining, you lean back on those crutches. Where at Giant Steps, I'd learnt the importance of gravity flow winery, avoiding pumping as much as possible, avoiding filtration where you could. Some of those things helped a lot. Don't cost you anything, but if you could understand the wine and the stability of the wine, you could bring in some of those things. A lot of that is bunch, texture, not smashing it with added acid, and then being very gentle with the wine, even if it is in a tank, still being gentle with it in terms of filtration and bottling, and finding painosity in a commercial space.
I suppose with that comes a little bit of satisfaction as well. You were running effectively two different labels, the Punt Road label, the Airlie Bank label you've mentioned, but finding a way, because you're dealing as a winemaker, I suppose, as a communicator as well, with the cellar door customer who comes to a region and understands what to expect, I suppose. What is the standard? And then how do we stand out among that standard? And then also going into the wine trade and traveling around and finding out a slightly different question, which is how do you excite the person who might be pouring that in a restaurant or in a bar?
Absolutely.
And just giving them a little bit extra. So was that a satisfaction of the role to effectively try and put something that was going to excite both the person who was going to be serving the wine and the person who would be drinking it?
Yeah, I would absolutely say an over-delivering, which is maybe a bit of a rational thing to say, but, the idea of exciting people and them going, how much does this cost? Franco at Hoddles Creek, people still shocked by the price of his Chardonnay and Pinot Noir. It's very satisfying when people are like, wow, you're delivering so much wine for this price. And that's really exciting for me because my customers are going to be excited by that. Yeah, I find that hugely rewarding, no doubt.
And now at Voyager, we've talked a lot about Margaret River. There seems to be so many connections that bring us back there. Obviously, that's where you are now. What was your excitement level at landing the role back in WA, but specifically at Voyager Estate, a place with among a really big hitting set of quality producers doing good things and with great potential.
Yeah, look, Western Australia certainly was calling us back. We'd been through a really long COVID period, which unfortunately Hillsville and the Yarra Valley got sucked into the Melbourne vortex during COVID. So the world had gone from feeling like a small place to a very big place for a lot of people in COVID, I know, with that inability to travel. And suddenly Western Australia seemed like a place we were getting drawn back to. But saying that, I wouldn't have come back for just anything. We have such fond memories of Hillsville. It's funny, people say to me, oh, you must love living in Margaret River. Like, the move must have been incredible. And, Margaret River is incredibly beautiful. The weather is gorgeous. It really is. It's the Byron Bay of Western Australia, and I get it. But most people who moved here have not come from Hillsville and the Yarra Valley, which we loved. So we're in a slightly different boat to most people in just the move of my wife, my kids, and the family. Voyager was a very appealing proposition when the job came up because it is a bit of a jewel in the crown of Margaret River. Alex Bird, who owns Voyager, has an incredible capacity and vision for what will happen in the future, and the sustainable element in organic viticulture, in a genuine carbon emissions plan and strategy and target, a genuine sense of an ethical compass to the business, and to feel like you could do a body of work and leave some sort of legacy, when you get to that sort of 40, what was I then, 42, 43, start talking about that. To think you could put a body of work down before you have to hang up your boots, that was very appealing.
Yeah, and on that note, how would you describe the kind of wines that you want to put your name to, having travelled to all those different places, thought a lot about it, done some of the unsexy stuff? What kind of things from a wine structure and quality point of view, but also from a ethos point of view, what do you want the Voyager wines under Tim Shan to show people, and how would you like them to be understood?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And funnily enough, I just had Rob Mann and Jen and Andrew Marks from Gembrook Hill and his partner Sophie just came past the winery to have a look. As anyone who's read your work will know, you did a fantastic story into Andrew and his relationship with Rob and Simon Oscar, which is a great read if anyone's listening. And so they just came past, and Rob said to me, talk to me about what you think you should make out of Voyager Estate Chardonnay, which is always like, oh, shit, okay. So I'm glad he asked me because I'm warmed up for this question. We talked a lot about that tension between the weight and the power of the fruit, and obviously this sort of burnt lime, particularly in gingin, this saltiness, and getting that balance right is really interesting. That generosity of flavour, but with persistence as well. But I think the longer I go, I want to see in the wines we make and that I make an effortlessness, a grace, a harmony, which is often quite hard. And in a way at Punt Road, sometimes we had to kind of knock people's heads off with bunch or with Cab Franc character or with Grillon skins. We had to grab a character and say to people, look at this, look how cool this is. And that's for very good reasons. But the more wines of the world you taste and are exposed to, you realise the very best wines have an effortlessness to them and a harmony. And then that translates into a drinkability. They're the bottles that disappear really quickly on the table, even if they're very expensive. And finding the detail and the harmony, that's where I'd like to be for sure. So that nothing, whether it's Chardonnay or Cabernet or Merlot or Chenin Blanc, there's a harmony and everything, every cylinder pushing in the same direction. So you don't think about any of the parts, you just think about that whole wine that you're drinking. And yeah, absolutely a refreshment and a delicious quality.
And from that point of view, I suppose we've talked a little bit about the winemaking levers. I mean, especially at that conversation at Punt Road, Airlie Bank. Well, understanding what you've got and understanding who's going to be drinking that and what they need to get out of it to be satisfied. Does it feel like now you've got an opportunity to discover how far you can go? I mean, you've got a cracking vineyard in an ideal location, solid backing, and a chance to really direct the fruit to its ultimate expression. I mean, that must be the perfect challenge.
Yeah, it is. And actually, to be honest, it's a challenge to me because there is an ambition to take things to a much, much higher level. And so it's a challenge to me because I'm not going to get away with the same old one tricks anymore in the space that we're going to look to inhabit. And that's not a bad thing at all, but it is a challenge. There was an element when I was recruited, I think, at Voyager, that they loved the idea that I'd made wines that engaged, the Melbourne and Sydney trade, and that we'd really made Punt Road, which was a little bit backward, we'd made that very relevant and very contemporary. So I'm sure Voyager thought there was some elements of that. But actually, as we've gone along, where this winery now sits in this vineyard, it's time for us to really grow up and evolve very much into where we want to be in terms of Margaret River which means vineyard, and finding the detail and the tiny things in the vineyard that we can do, and then the meticulousness in the winery. So it is quite different and a lot more challenging than Punt Road in that way. It's going to be a learning curve, there's no doubt.
One of the words that I seem to keep coming back to at the moment, and it was something that came up when I was talking to Steve Flamsteed about Giant Steps, is how certain projects, and obviously we know it from the so-called old world, how the idea of pedigree and track record can be linked together. But even in a relatively short time at Giant Steps, the team managed to engender quite a lot of affection in sites and in wines and in identity as well. It's all very well to make wines of quality. I mean, that is not the easiest thing in any circumstances anyway, but also to take the time to foster that appreciation of who you are and what you're trying to do, and that you're different from other people.
Yeah.
Is that something as well that sort of feeds into the excitement of that challenge?
Yeah, it's my word. What is your lens and what is your version of what's going on? Particularly for me with Margaret River, I'm very self-conscious that I've never really made wine in Margaret River. And you've gone off and done stuff in the Yarra Valley, and Margaret River people, I'm sure, would be very happy to tell me I don't know nothing, particularly Cabernet, and I'm willing to cop that. But by the same token, to think, oh, well, hang on you, I've got the fact that I've gone off and seen all these things, and I'll be able to hopefully put that lens on it. And talking just now to Rob Mann and Andrew, so fascinating, because that's kind of my past and my future sitting in front of me, I hope. And they were having a tension. They were arguing about Cabernet in particular. Andrew pretending he didn't give two shits about Cabernet, and Rob pretending he didn't give two shits about Pinot. I think, yes, that is the potential. I'm thinking about, quality, what is quality, and the idiosyncrasy. And just to give you an example, the Chardonnays of Margaret River, Piero and Lewin, and some of the more old school makers versus McHenry Honan or Stella Bella, and where Voyager sits in that, and what I could bring to that conversation with the fruit that we have, because we're in a very special place for Chardonnay. We've got Lewin next door, we've got Luminosa next door to right the other way, and Stevens Road for Xanadu. So we are really in Rolls-Royce Chardonnay territory here, just south of Margaret River. I love Luke Jolliffe's wines at Stella Bella. I love Suckerfizzle, I love Luminosa. But God, if we make that, that's a real failure. If we just try to emulate what Luke's doing, because we'll be expressing nothing of Voyager. And that opportunity we have to explore something a bit different here. And Lewin next door, they're in a totally different boat, because they deliberately approach their Chardonnay making very differently, and the results everyone knows well. But again, to just try to emulate them would be a huge mistake.
It's really interesting you spoke to Rob today, because I think Carimbia does go to that point that I just made, actually, of, there is a expectation with Margaret River Cabernet Sauvignon. It's got a reputation and it's really well loved, and people would like to call it a style. And yet, in a relatively short time, Rob Mann and Jen Mann have managed to do exactly what I'm talking about, actually. Give people a recognition of something and to become affectionate about a place in a relatively short time, because they understand what the intent is behind it. It can clearly be done with a lot of work, but certainly the authenticity conversation that we had with AC Grayling, I think, comes into that understanding that's passed on. It's a two-way thing, probably. Yeah. How you express yourself and how people understand what you're saying.
Yeah, and I think hopefully you bring your own skills and your own knowledge and wisdom, which clearly Rob and Jen have in spades. And then at the same time, you're building the knowledge of sight, which cannot be underestimated. And it's quite funny, a lot of people have sort of said, what are you going to do with Voyager? What are you going to change? What is your style? What's this? What's that? And it's like, hang on. These are the same people who, have read every book by Hugh Johnson or Jancis or whoever, and all the history and the time and the dedication of all the people they love and the generations, and yet they expect, from Voyager in 3 years that we'll totally, turn the ship around and go in a different direction, and we'll be assured stylistically, and we'll know every inch of the vineyard. And of course, they want me to say something dramatic, but it doesn't work that way at all, unfortunately.
Now, someone also said, to me, winemaking is not an art. I think it's a trade. It's arguably more like being a jeweler or a carpenter. I think if you're telling people you're an artist, you're a bullshit artist. That was, of course, the young Tim Shan saying that.
Stop using my own words against me, Ed. This is...
The reason I bring that up is because I know that you have a very well-attuned bullshit radar. And I think also that you probably feel like the bullshit, in the end, cheats everyone. Doesn't really serve the person trying to achieve something on the making end, and it certainly doesn't achieve very much for someone on the receiving end. And I just wanted to dwell on that a little bit just the communication of what you do as a wine grower and how you communicate, hopefully, the value that you're creating. We're talking a lot these days about premiumization and how wine is going to be fine in the long run because we just have to talk it up. But obviously that's a very crowded space, and it's also a really misunderstood story or not particularly well told, and it's a loud, crowded, noisy sphere. What do you think the challenge is for getting the point across of the specialness and the value of wine from all points of view?
And we risk it. There's far too much cynicism because we've done the puffery to death. You know, we've all been so busy competing with each other and just get ourselves heard. And I've been guilty as anyone of a bit of puffery and a willingness to kind of expand the truth a touch to service our own sales or reputation But I completely understand where it comes from. We're all trying to make this thing work in what's been quite a difficult time. You've spoken to Professor Grayling recently, and he was right on it with this, you know, where he's like, you absolutely must have a very clear idea of who you want to be and how you want to live. And would that be part of it? You know, not being authentic and not doing what you say you should do. Ethically, we know that's murky. But where does it leave the people who are listening to you, who are actually relying on your authenticity and your integrity, actually, is what it is. And how valuable that integrity is in a place like Margaret River, you know, where we're trying to establish ourselves on a world stage. Australians have been good, I guess, in general, compared to particularly the French, in not having to wax lyrical and create these myths. But by the same token, we probably are trying to pull ourselves up on the back of a bit of puffery. And it will bite us in the ass, you know, it will be a house of cards that we build that will fall over if it's not got integrity at its heart, that's for sure.
There are a million ways to talk about wine, and lots of people would tell us that mostly wine people don't do it very well.
No.
That they distract somehow, whether it's distracting from telling a cliched story when the more intricate one is more interesting, or whether it's throwing facts out there when what we really want is something with a sort of more emotional connection. You were talking off air a little bit earlier about communicating to your wine team, your Celador team there, about how to look at wine. What advice would you give for trying to strip back some of the things that we're tempted to say to what we should actually care about, because it's probably what other people care about?
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's a really good question. And you know, we do get a bit sucked into how much whole bunch or how much new oak, what percent Merlot, what percent Cabernet, what pH, and kind of drown ourselves in the weeds of all of that. We're increasingly mindful that we want a group of people who communicate with our customers at Voyager who are burning with an energy that comes from our activities as grape growers and winemakers, where the integrity of what we do, and hopefully going to increasingly work with us to see that and do that, is the flame for them, and then that flame actually drives them to discover more, hopefully, beyond pH and whole bunch percentage. And then they can pass that flame to our customers, because there is nothing the customer needs worse than, you know, our cellar door staff regurgitating the pH or the alcohol or the date of picking. Our customers want that flame, and I'm not able to serve all of them, and obviously barely any of them actually. So the cellar door staff are the conduit for that energy, and that the sum total of everything that we do, hopefully that lights that flame within them. And that drives them and hopefully makes them enjoy their jobs more as well. They've got longevity because they just love carrying that flame of what we're doing. And that's not unique to Voyager at all. We're all out there doing these things every day. You're quite right to say we communicate poorly. There does seem to be a disconnect between that and then our trying to package that up in an information sheet and then somehow regurgitate that to a customer. You know, if you give me an hour with a person in the Voyager winery or in the vineyard, they will drink Voyager for life. Like that, they will carry that flame for life. I don't think I've got time to do it for enough people to sell all that wine, unfortunately. But I think there's a responsibility, and this is something we were talking about with Grayling while he was here. We, as the generation that's trying to consolidate this wine game in Australia, you know, the first generation were the pioneers, and I'm sort of talking the previous generation to me. I'm not talking, you know, the people who planted Hill of Grace or Busby. I'm talking the people who established fine wine as a thing for Australia in the 70s, 80s, 90s. This second generation, I think our role will be, as Grayling was saying, to find the place for wine in the good life of Australia, but to explain and demonstrate to people why they should spend the sort of prices we're putting on these wines and why that's important, and then without the use of puffery, and explain to them the substance of the wine that let's say we're selling for $70 a bottle, and why that's important and why that will be part of them living the good life. I think that's our great responsibility in this second generation, because we've all sort of signed up, as you said, to the premiumisation. We've all got to start harvesting these amazing vineyards and wines that we've made. But I don't actually think we've landed the next part, which is that there's the people who are ready to accept those wines. And I think that's our responsibility.
Yeah, I mean, there's something that came up as well with AC grailing that I've been pondering, and when we were setting up this conversation, pondering further, because it's something I feel is really lacking in wine in Australia, maybe in the world in general, and not just in wine, but actually in the way that people make a lot of choices. And that is almost like a lack of imagination, how hard it is these days to persuade someone that something is of value beyond what they can see literally right in front of their face. That idea of that everything is quid pro quo, transactional value. And it's a real difficulty in communicating to people anything to do with the long-term aim in life. And that led me back to the philosopher Mary Warnock and her book, Imagination and Time. And I'm just going to read a little quote from that, which is, "Without imagination, we should be lost, for only with its help can we interpret our experience, turn it into experience of an outer world, and thus make use of it in understanding what and where we are and what we need to do." I just like that. And it speaks to me of this experience of maybe tasting wine or visiting a region, speaking to someone who grows or makes stuff, and just thinking beyond, is this my thing? Will I buy it? Is it cheap? Did it get a high score? Does it make me look clever? Whatever. What about, does this thing say something to me about me and my life and what I believe and how I want to live?
And I feel like we might have been, as winemakers, a bit ungenerous. You know, we sort of see ourselves as the temple, and everyone comes and picks up their goodies of us. But yeah, the idea that it could be fulfilling and mind expanding to the people who drink it, and actually they're more important all along, I think that's quite exciting. I love the idea of wine as a vessel of imagination, and you know, Anthony Grayling spoke to the detail and the effort and the complexity of making wine, and how rewarding that would be to people drinking if they understood it. And I think you've taken it to another level with expanding their imagination, expanding their horizon to what's possible in this glass capsule you put on the table as a portal, geographical, but also in your imagination.
Yeah.
I think that's really exciting.
Well, as I say, I mean, if we're going to talk about an alcoholic product, that we're just going to talk about price and we're going to talk about perceived reputation, we're missing the whole point, and we're missing conversations and we're missing value. If we can't do that. And, you know, it really is on probably wine people to communicate that thing that's beyond the literal.
And by the way, in an environment where people are quite exhausted, you know, where people are working really hard, they're probably working quite close to the bone with their margins or with their stock or with their debtors and creditors. And that's probably not a great mental space to be in. And that for me was Professor Grayling. People sort of said, it must have been so challenging, stimulating, intellectual. Actually, it was incredibly reinvigorating, because the podcast you did with him, you know, everything goes around and comes around, and, you know, whether it be earthquakes and floods or powdery mildew and, you know, the anti-alcohol lobby, just that he gave me great solace. We should all have a philosopher that we get to hang out with after vintage. Every winemaker needs a post-vintage hangout with a philosopher in residence. He gave me enormous solace, and then from that solace and from that much better mental space, I was more able to open up my imagination and to embrace what he was saying about how special wine is, because it can be a brutal taskmaster, and it's not just in an economics, commercial sense. Wine can be a difficult taskmaster because it's so volatile in growing the grapes. I find there's about a 1 month window now where I'm not thinking about the weather. It's about now. It's just ended, actually, because it's obviously from the last grape that you pick. And then you do want some rain pretty quick after you pick to give the vines a bit of a zhuzh up so they can hold their leaf and get the carbohydrates back to their roots. You get about a month of not having to worry about the weather because it doesn't matter. And then in Margaret River, you start thinking about when winter's going to come, which apparently is not any time soon this year. In winter, you're thinking about have you had enough rain, have you had enough cold, and whether you're going to get the dormancy in the vines, particularly in Chardonnay. And then, of course, come spring, you're thinking about disease pressure and rain. You start thinking about vigour, and you start thinking about shoot thinning, and you start thinking about what the summer's going to bring in terms of your canopy management. And obviously as summer goes, is it too hot? Is it too dry? Is it too wet? Is it too cold? You go into Christmas and you're pretty actively thinking about that vineyard. People don't really have Christmas, they get Christmas Day off, but they can't take the 2 weeks off the rest of us like to. And then, of course, as you get into veraison, that's the very pointy end where day by day you're measuring the weather, and then you're into harvest, and then it's minute by minute. That's just the weather aspect of what's on your mind when you're trying to make very good wine. And so it's something like 11 months of the year kind of on some sort of alert footing. And then the volatility that we find eats away a bit is the market and what people are drinking or not drinking, and how quickly that can shift, and the fact that we can't shift so quickly, the vines or the wine style. So yeah, that does take its toll, and if it's not going that well, over time it drains you. And I found Anthony, when he was here, Professor Grayling, he kind of filled my cup a bit on that front.
That's good to hear. And we're actually nearing the time on a Friday where your cup will literally be filled. And if it's not going to be a Margaret River Chardonnay or Cabernet, because it's not allowed to be, because everyone keeps talking too much about Margaret River on this show, what wine would you like to see filling that cup tonight?
Well, I'm making up lost ground on Bordeaux. The PTSD, I've had some therapy, and I'm trying to make friends with Bordeaux again, because I think, in terms of availability, accessibility, but also all the wonderful things we've been talking about, imagination, creativity, craft. There is a lot to explore in Bordeaux, and I would really like to get my head around it. We did a Bordeaux tasting here last night with the team. We tasted a wine from each commune from 2015, or each of the communes you'd sort of think about. And in doing some research, came across a wonderful quote, which I should have written down, but basically, Bordeaux is the welterweight of the red wine world, and if we try to emulate Napa or Barossa or warmer climes with their heavyweight Cabernets, all is lost. What a waste of time. I just thought, what a great way to pitch Cabernet, that it's not a full-bodied red. It's certainly not Pinot Noir either, but this svelte, elegant, savoury, classical wine with enormous tradition and history and complexity. It's in a way in Australia been hiding in plain sight. So it feels like a new undertaking to be able to get my head around Bordeaux.
And that's going to be the first glass you have?
Yeah, sure. There's a beer. There was probably a beer in there, but, no one wants to hear about that.
That's it for this week's podcast. If you enjoyed listening to it, please like it, subscribe, share with your tribe. Seriously, it makes a huge difference. You can also subscribe to my Substack. That's edmerison.substack.com. Feel free to leave a comment too. I'd love to know what you'd like to hear more of. But for now, I'd like to say thank you to Lucas James for the music, Neil Williams for the artwork, Elizabeth Clancy for the edit, and to my guest, Tim Shan. Till next time, live wine to the fullest. Cheers!